All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker for our session, Dr. Michael Goran. Where's Michael? Oh, you're here, so okay. Michael, he was at the preventive medicine at USC, University of Southern California School of Medicine. He told me that recently he moved to the Children's Hospital, also at USC. Michael has done a tremendous amount of work on sugar intake and other nutritional factors in the childhood obesity. So Michael, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much, Frank, for the introduction, for giving my talk previously. Certainly a great warm-up for my talk, and to the Norch, is that what we say it? For organizing this symposium and for inviting me. Thank you so much. So I'm going to continue the story, obviously in sugars, but talk from a developmental perspective, on how sugars play a role in derailing normal healthy development, and how this new nutritional landscape that we have developed, that was described beautifully by Barry earlier, how this nutritional environment is in fact affecting development beginning in utero through infancy and childhood. And I'll start off by talking about another form of sugars. You might not have heard of secondhand sugars. If you hadn't heard of it, that's because I made it up recently. Secondhand sugars describe how, starting in the fetus and in infancy, individuals are exposed inadvertently to sugars. Fetuses aren't choosing to consume sugar, but yet, turns out, they are extremely vulnerable to the effects of those sugars because those sugars can affect development. So we're talking here about the involuntary exposure of sugars and sweeteners, as we'll talk about, in the fetus, in the infant, and in childhood from either maternal consumption during pregnancy or breastfeeding, or from hidden sugars and sweeteners in infant formula or in baby food targeted to children. These effects can affect metabolism, can affect cellular development during critical periods of growth and organ development, such as in the brain, for example, that I'll talk about later, when vulnerability to sugars during these periods is critically high, establishing long-term risk throughout life for chronic diseases that we've been talking about already. We already talked about the sugar mountain, the increased amounts of sugar that are being consumed in the US, has already been talked, and the different mixes of sugars. It's not just sucrose anymore, different types of sugars. So not only are we consuming more sugar, but different types of sugar. Here's a list of at least 61 names for sugar. But I just learned this morning that the ECHO Foundation has an online archive that is now 179 names for different types of sugar. So the food industry has become very smart in making up names that sound elaborate and healthy to fool consumers. And also, I'll talk a little bit on non-nutritive sweeteners. Already come up this morning, and will be talked about a bit much more extensively tomorrow. And I'll talk about them again in the context specifically of development, not whether they're useful or not for weight loss. That's a very interesting debate. My question is, how does exposure during development affect long-term programming? These are just some examples of common sweeteners, but also there's a growing list of low-calorie or zero-calorie alternative sweeteners that are becoming pretty ubiquitous in the food supply, and again, pretty common among beverages and foods targeted to children. So the jury is still out. We'll talk about this a lot more tomorrow, but again, I'm going to talk specifically about the long-term effects and how these compounds might harm development. We know consumption of non-nutritive sweeteners is increased in children. This is a paper from Alison Slavetsky at GW, from the Ann Haynes data, showing increases in percent of children consuming non-nutritive sweeteners in any food or beverages from 2000 to the period of 2012 during different NHANES cycles. You can see a large increase, and most of that increase has come from beverages. Also, recent work, this is not yet published, the paper's in review, but I'll share it with you today, again with Alison and her team at GW that I was a part of. Among pregnant women in NHANES, the same is also true. There's been an increase in consumption of non-nutritive sweeteners during pregnancy. Now about 25% of women consume on any daily basis any food or beverage with non-nutritive sweetener, mostly in beverages. And as I will talk about, at least we know now from an epidemiological perspective, we don't yet know the mechanism, but I'll share with you the data showing that this can be harmful to the fetus in terms of risk for obesity in the offspring. Among those pregnant women, most of the consumption is among more highly educated women. You can see here almost 35% of higher educated women and higher levels among non-Hispanic whites compared to other ethnic groups. So the overall question of my research program then is, how does this change in nutrient profile? The shift to more sugars, more of that sugar being fructose and more of those sugars being non-nutritive sweeteners. How does it affect growth and development during infancy and childhood? And if you consider an infant was never metabolically designed to be exposed to fructose, because fructose is not a natural component of breast milk, yet we now, as Barry beautifully showed in that slide, we have this paradox now where our environment has gotten ahead of our metabolism. We're not designed, infants weren't designed to be able to handle fructose. In fact, they don't even have the GLUT5 receptor in the gut to absorb it into the circulation, so it will potentially affect gut health, gut microbiome. So we're looking at this from a number of different perspectives, at the gut and the liver and the brain, whole body adipose tissue, and how this is affected by maternal transfer of sugars. So I'll talk a little bit about, not all of these because I don't have time, but I'll talk to you about some of the more relevant data. So there's actually multiple reasons to believe why infants and children are more vulnerable to not only consuming more sugars and sweeteners, but are more vulnerable, once they've eaten it, they're more vulnerable to the effects of those sugars on metabolism. And first and foremost, as we'll hear later this afternoon from the expert in this field, Julie Manella, who showed a long time ago, infants and children actually have a greater innate preference for sweet taste. And this again was a protective mechanism to get them to like breast milk. It wasn't meant to make them like all the other nutritional products that are in the food environment now. So as a result, are more likely to want, demand, prefer sweeter foods and consume more of it. Exposure to these sugars, as I'll show you in utero, can make this taste preference more profound. And as I will show you, exposure to the brain, for example, during brain development can cause irreversible programming. Most of that work is from animal models because it's very hard to study exactly what's going on in the brain in humans. So a couple of other examples also. I'll show you some data from, for example, if you put pre-adipocyte cells in culture, these are cells that aren't yet fully differentiated to fat cells, but if you put those pre-adipocyte cells in culture, they're extremely sensitive to even very low levels of fructose concentration, which can affect gene expression and disrupt the whole biology of adipose tissue, making them more likely to proliferate by turning on adipogenesis. And there's similar evidence that this exists also when you expose pre-adipocyte cells to non-nutritive sweeteners. So this may mean that even very low levels of these sugars or sweeteners may have profound long-term effects long-term. Okay, now I first got into this field when we published this paper in 2012 because we had shown in Los Angeles that the highest levels of childhood obesity were in low-income children, where we showed about 35 percent obesity in low-income children, and among low-income children we found highest levels even by age 2 to 4 years of age among Hispanic children. So it got us very interested to understand what was going on particularly in low-income Hispanic children who were highly susceptible to development of obesity in the first few years of life. So we got hold of some WIC data in Los Angeles. These are low-income children whose parents were receiving WIC support. And the WIC program in Los Angeles keeps very good records of height and weight in those children, so we're able to calculate obesity. And they also performed this sub-study in a group of about 1,500 children where we collected dietary data. And we looked across the diet at different factors, trying to understand which ones were related to this early onset of obesity in this vulnerable population. And the most significant finding was sugary beverages. So we separated them into 3 groups. Who at 2 to 4 years of age were not yet consuming sugary beverages, approximately 1 serving per day or 2 servings per day, is how we categorized it in this particular study, and just basically looked at the epidemiological association with obesity based on a definition of a BMI above the 95th percentile. And we found this significant association whereby we saw much higher levels of obesity in consumers versus non-consumers, and this is already evident by 2 to 4 years of age. Several years later, in 2014, the Centers for Disease Control published a study from a nationally representative sample of children who were followed over 6 years. You can see here they were first studied in 2005 to 2007, and then 6 years of and then at 6 years of age, where they measured body fat by DEXA. And they looked at the effect of early exposure to sugar-sweetened beverages, including juice drinks, but not 100% juice in this particular study. And they looked at it in 3 categories. Those children who never consumed sugar-sweetened beverages in infancy, those who were introduced to sugar-sweetened beverages after 6 months of age, and those who were introduced before 6 months of age. And I can tell you from the work that we do, that's a fairly significant segment of the population that we work with. Again, this is a nationally representative sample, but nevertheless they showed a significant epidemiological association with a much higher level of obesity. Almost 20% of these nationally representative children were obese at 6 years of age, compared to 9% based on age of introduction of sugar-sweetened beverages. So there's multiple reasons why early consumption of sugars, and in particular possibly fructose, how they can affect development. We published this perspective piece in 2013 that described the different ways by which maternal diet, and in particular fructose, can affect different pathways, including adipogenesis, like I mentioned, as I will show you later, hypothalamic development, and appetite regulation. And also, we didn't really realize it at the time in 2013, but obviously this field of research has exploded massively. Gut microbiome development is potentially another mechanism by which early exposure to fructose or other sugars may affect long-term health, especially, as I mentioned, in infants who aren't even able possibly to absorb fructose into the circulation, so it may directly impact the gut and gut microbiome development. This study was from the Southampton Women's Study, published in 2014, and this was a phenomenal study that measured diet before pregnancy and during pregnancy, and has data on body fat levels in children at 4 years of age and 6 years of age. And this study didn't look at sugars in particular, but looked at glycemic load and glycemic load in early pregnancy. And specifically, this finding was unique